I'm Dave Wiesdock, Sage of Creative Scaffolding.
And I'm Jen West, Professional Rebel of Delight.
And this is Shadow Casting. Hey everyone. So this week, Jen and I have been talking about self-care. We've been having quite a few discussions with people in our community about self-care. And what we realized is that self-care really is an amazing tool to create space for you. And when you start doing the work, especially with shadow casting, self-care becomes step one, not the final step. It's not just I took a bubble bath today, or I went to this Pilates seminar this weekend, or I started a new diet. Those are all first steps. And real self-care, what we're going to dig into today, is recognizing that those steps are important because they create space for us to do the work. But then we got to get into the work, into kind of the discomfort. I think we have some fun stuff to dig into today for our audience.
For sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because we hear the importance of self-care. And I don't think the majority of us actually know what that means. I think most people, when they hear self-care, are thinking about those who overwork and never take time off, or who have a very stressful job or stressful life and they need to decompress and disengage from the world. And in those instances, it's almost like the person's one-sided. Maybe if they're hyper depressed, they're told to go outside and take walks, and that's the cure for that. So whether you have anxiety or depression or your life is just crazy stressful, there's this one tool that's supposed to break you out of it that's called self-care.
Yeah.
And then it gets lost. It turns into almost an act of escapism from your life.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, because as you were talking, I actually recognize that for me, I want to take a step back. We got to talk about the stigma of self-care, right? Because there's a whole shadow casting around self-care itself that I think needs to be addressed to really have the willingness to deep dive where we're going to go with this. Because we're saying that the thing that has kind of this stigma, like you're talking about, of you've got to be in this really stressed state to do self-care, is almost like it becomes a requirement. I can only do self-care if I am really stressed and super overwhelmed. And so subconsciously, we start to create this constant state of adrenal fatigue, staying in our sympathetic nervous system, where we are just in our fight, flight, or fright kind of mentality. And so that's what we learn. We create a habit around it. The self-care habit then becomes this loop of I have to be stressed in order to do self-care, but the self-care doesn't really address the stress, as we're going to talk about. And so you go, all right, I'm still stressed, so let me do more self-care. And you create this loop of always trying to kind of get yourself out of this stressed state, not realizing that the very act of the self-care that you're doing is almost feeding it, because you're not doing what we're going to talk about, which is next step of self-care. Another way of looking at this is I see self-care is touted as the antidote to stress. I see it as the progenitor to the antidote for stress. Like it's that first step.
Yeah, it's what gives you the space to actually change and do some real work. That's the first step of it. And it's not really that self-care is the first step, it's the initial tool that's the first step of it. And I love what you said about you have to be stressed, or you have to have high anxiety, or you have to be depressed before you even recognize that self-care is necessary. And that's a mind-boggling thought. It hadn't hit me, but you are so spot on there, Dave. Unless we are in the throes of everything going wrong, self-care is not even considered. And that should be our entire life, is self-care, where stress comes in a little, not stress is the standard
Yeah.
that we drop off from.
tying this in, I feel like this really ties to priority, right?
Mm.
Self care is a, hmm, not sure chicken versus egg. Self care is how we tap into our great self care creates awareness around where our priority really is. Maybe that's how I want to phrase it.
I like that wording.
Yeah, because is your priority what we were talking about, that stress and anxiety and overwhelm? Because people, I can already hear our audience going, no, of course not. I don't choose to be stressed and overwhelmed, Dave. It's like no one chooses it consciously, but there are moments where I even get in stress or overwhelmed still. And so I have to ask myself, where is my role in this? And that is a powerful tool of self-care because self-care is creating the awareness of where is my priority? Where is my focus? Because where focus goes, energy flows. While yes, taking a bubble bath can be relaxing, the real work comes after that.
And I think, at least in the US, being stressed is looked upon as a good thing. I mean, not
Badge of
really as a
honor.
good thing. Yeah, it's a badge of honor. If you are busy and you've got a lot of tasks that need to be done and you're working at, I'm going to curse, a shit ton of hours, then you are doing what you're supposed to do as an American. It's all about that drive, and it's all about doing as much work as you can and succeeding. Got my air quotes going. And it puts this false front on, and self-care becomes the antithesis of that. Instead of
Ooh.
feeding, it's kind of like, no, if I do self-care, then I'm not living life.
I think we're actively hunting self-care during this podcast
Yeah.
because you're absolutely right. There's almost a stigma. Like, how can you create a sense of relaxation if the actual tool itself is stigmatized? I don't think you can because that's going to generate these feelings of maybe guilt, shame, embarrassment. It almost becomes taboo. Self-care is taboo.
Self-care is like therapy was,
Yes.
a decade ago, where it's like, oh, you're in therapy. I mean, now therapy's cool. Everybody's like, go to Better Health.
Well,
you
actually,
know?
you are on the point of where we, I think, want to clarify this, right? Because there is benefit to therapy, there is benefit to self-care, but we've made that the destination where it's just part of the journey. I would love to get clarity on how we define self-care from the shadow casting perspective, because I think that's going to add context to how we're looking at it through the lens we're going to talk about it.
Well, we could start with the definition just from the dictionary,
Sure.
which the definition there too. The first one is the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's own health. And the other one is the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. So I think the second one is kind of what people associate with self care. Like, I'm crazy stressed out. I need to take a break, clear out my life from people, and take a bubble bath and read a good book.
I agree. And in part of your definition, you brought up well-being. And to me, I think that requires some further clarification because I've seen four aspects of well-being, the seven pillars of well-being. I've seen different versions of the seven pillars. I've seen the eight pillars, the 10. It can get daunting, I think, thinking of
Yeah.
self-care in a sense of such a fractured sort of pie chart or graph. And what happens is, I feel we tend to go to the self care mode of where we are neglecting our well being the most. Again, it's an awareness tool. If you are stressed and your go to is a bubble bath to physically relax you, that probably means that that's where the work needs to happen, is your physical well being. Vice versa, somebody might find it relaxing to read, and so their mental well-being is sort of craving this attention. what I feel self care's value really comes in at is through the lens of mindfulness. It brings awareness to where our well being could use some TLC, and we go, okay, I can feel relaxed. Ooh, okay. So where I think the mistake of self care comes in is we create we think we're creating space with our emotions. We think we're creating space with our stress, but it's so nuanced and so tricky because it can turn into something like escapism so deceptively easily,
Yeah.
which is really bad grammar. However, it's this idea that I have a beautiful example. Here's my story. One of my archetypes that I play with, and we talk about archetypes a lot on our podcast, is the hermit. And my hermit is my self care archetype. However, he has a very fine line of not isolating. And what I've learned as I've grown into this archetype is that the hermit doesn't teach me to retreat from life. The hermit teaches me to retreat into life. It tells me find the things that I enjoy that cultivate my sense of resiliency with stress and overwhelm and do those things. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at too at the beginning of our podcast, which was the if you're depressed, go outside and walk. We have just found generally for the general population that being outside in nature helps with depression. And there's science to back that. We get more sunlight, which creates more vitamin D. It increases our serotonin and our dopamine in our brain because we're exercising and we're walking. So there are active health benefits that counteract the physiochemicalness of depression within someone. And that isn't something you should just do when you're feeling stressed. Those kind of things they shouldn't be a reaction to the stress. It should be a response to what you're trying to cultivate in your life. And that's why I think this is such a cool topic for shadow casting, because we're taking something that is normally casted out as this industry standard. Every industry talks about self-care in some way, whether you're a remote worker and it's getting up every 10 to 15 minutes to stretch your body a little bit, whether you're dealing with therapy and depression, whether you're dealing with burnout from everything going on in the world. It's this idea of self-care has been created as a reaction. And I think that's where the mistake is.
Exactly. It's taking the tool, that one tool, and deciding that that's the outcome. The tool is the outcome. So you're feeling stressed. And if you do go outside and walk, that fixes everything. That's the fix. And really, the tool is to create enough space that you can kind of see what a life should be. So, having trouble putting this into words. So, if the tool is to go outside, as Dave was saying, the outcome is not to walk outside. It's because it changes your brain chemistry, and being in nature makes you more connected with the world, and the exercise pumps the blood through your body and it makes you feel alive again. And that's the science behind it. So it's not about the walk, it's about what makes you feel alive and how do you start cultivating that. And it really is a game of changing your relationship with you. If you have that high anxiety and you take a bath and listen to music and it soothes that anxiety, that's not the fix. It's only going to work for a little time. It's like taking a pill because you have a headache. It's going to wear off and you're going to go back to the headache. You have to solve the problem. Why do you have the headache?
Thank you for saying that, because that has generated in me the analogy I think we're trying to hit at here. Self-care isn't a magic pill. When you use self-care as a magic pill, it becomes hollow for you. It prioritizes momentary space from stress over the work of doing the personal growth to create a different environment, both within and without, of how you handle stress to begin with.
Yeah.
Here's a I have two examples. When I was a chiropractor, I would always talk to my patients about the cause. They would come in and they would say, "Oh my God, my back's been killing me for 10 years." And I'd go, "Great. Chiropractic can help. We can do X, Y, and Z. We took some x rays. Here's some physical therapy you can do at home, all these things." Then they would come back a week later and they would say, "Okay, I felt some momentary relief and now the pain's back." And I'd ask them, "What have you been doing at home to facilitate this change?" Because here's the problem, and here's where the misstep occurs, in my opinion. We create habits and an environment around us that facilitates the environment we are currently in. Whether we do that consciously or unconsciously is up for debate, but that's part of what self-care can do. It's the tool to help you take the unconscious and make it conscious so that you can make different choices. When I had patients that came in and complained of back pain 2, 3 weeks after adjustments, I'd get curious. I'd lean into my values and my kind of scaffolding, and I'd ask them, "What are you doing day to day? What do you like when you go home after work? Are you going for a walk or are you sitting on the couch?" "Well, I'm sitting on the couch, but I have a pillow behind my back to, give me lumbar support." And so they think that that's the self care. It's the magic pill, the quick fix. But self care is active, it is a practice. That's the part that jumped out at me when we were reading the definitions earlier. Both talked about it being a practice, not a one time event to erase all your stress. It is a practice, it is a cultivation, it's an art. It's something that you have to be an active participant in. And the patients that decided to go with the pillow for lumbar support didn't improve. But I'll tell you, the ones where I was like, "Hey, before you go use the pillow for lumbar support, walk around for 5 minutes." "Oh, it's too cold." "Okay, walk in your house. Walk from the bathroom to your bedroom or from your kitchen upstairs to the bedroom and back and forth for 5 minutes and then go sit down." And then they do that and they go, "Okay, well, I felt one day better. All right, I'll do it for 10." And so the idea is that it's the practice, but because it starts off small and in bite-sized chunks, it's more palatable for us to be able to embrace these kind of things. And here's the thing, in my opinion, the walking and the pillow are both self-care, but one is being used to actively address the trigger for why you're in that pain to begin with, if we're looking at it from low back pain.
Yeah, yeah. And if we go back to the emotional with the anxiety and listening to music or taking a bubble bath, what is happening in that? Because the tool has a point. What is it actively doing? When you have anxiety, anxiety is normally a worry about the future, things that are going to happen, things that you don't have control over, things that can spiral in your head. So, what does listening to the music do? It brings you to the moment. It shuts all those thoughts out. And anxiety is not just thinking about possibilities that can happen in the future, it's getting your body so involved that it thinks it's being attacked by a lion. Like it gets reactive. It thinks it's happening. Everything has risen together. So not only are you planning for the future, but you brought your body along and now you're living it. And that's what anxiety is. So the tools, the only job of them is to bring you back to the moment, which is great because now you're in the moment. Now your body doesn't feel like it's being attacked and it isn't trying to fight this invisible enemy. That's why we called it the first step, these tools, because now you can go, okay, either I'm always going to plan for the future. That's kind of my thing. How do I separate that from being actively in it in my body where I'm creating the emotions? Or how do I step back and not make everything in the future something I have to worry about? And that takes so much work. That is the practice. So the music got you out of the state. Now you have to remold how you deal with the world,
Yeah.
what you think about, and how your emotions are. And that's how you get out of it.
I What comes up for me as you're talking about that actually is social media. And we work with people that when they share things, they talk about how their social media and their For You pages and the content that they are consuming is mm, not feeding their well-being isn't a positive impact on their well-being. And then you and I talk about what's on our social media and For You pages, and it's a very different context, right? We have people that are, free scaling rock walls and parkour and talking about the hard work and we follow people like Simon Sinek and Brene Brown and so it's interesting to me because what I think comes up and why this ties to self-care is that life itself is like a massive algorithm. Life is an algorithm. What you choose to react to and like and share and bookmark in your brain is going to feed that part of the algorithm versus you can choose to be conscious and be active in that. And I think that's what self-care does. Self-care says, I'm going to stop or I'm going to go unfollow these pages, the the things that are causing me stress in my life. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily remove those things out of your life, though that can be part of this. The idea is that you're creating space with the things that are causing you the stress to begin with. And so I bring this up because I think a great part of this segment to help our audience, to help you guys wade through, maybe you're listening and going at this point, all right, I hear what you're saying. There's the bubble bath that I can take, and then there's the bubble bath with maybe a little bit of journaling with some soft music that creates the ambiance of the self-care. But I'm actually journaling about what stressed me out that day so that I can process it and work through it. There's a very different environment in both those things, even though they're actually kind of happening in the same environment. Just like on your TikTok, for example, you and I can both be on a TikTok and be looking at very different content. But it's the same environment. It's both TikTok. So why do we see different content? Because of how we're choosing our own algorithm in our life. What comes up for me with this is the idea of how do we kind of hijack that in a self-care sense. What I think is one of the hardest parts of real self-care, but also one of the things we choose to avoid and why this is such a tough topic is that one of the indicators of real self-care is the uncomfortableness, the discomfort. It's painful, it's sucky, it's icky. In fact, I'll even share right before this call, Jen and I were talking about something that I'm going through. And there were 30 seconds of pauses sometimes as we were talking about things because I recognized the uncomfortableness. And rather than going, oh, I need to go take my bubble bath, I went, okay, I'm going to sit in this uncomfortableness. Maybe I'll sit in it while I'm in my bubble bath, but I'm going to sit in the uncomfortableness because the discomfort is the cue to kind of where the work I need to do.
Yeah. The tool makes you sane again if you're in the extreme. But self care, true self care, not the bubble baths, not the Pilates, not the going for a walk, not the going out for a beer with friends, not isolating for a week, to just get everybody out of your life, the staycation where you don't talk to anybody. The cleaning of your house, that's another self care. It's one of those tools where clean your house, clean your mind sort of idea. It's great. It's a beautiful tool. Yes, do it. And that's not self care. That's a tool that helps you start the process of
Yeah.
self care. It makes you realize that things are out of whack. But self care needs to be the default where stress is kind of it happens, but you naturally go back to the default of self care instead of being in stress, the little tiny tool of self care back to stress. We want to flip the switch on that. And as Dave said, the first step is to get uncomfortable. And here's where we're going to segue because I'm sure our audience is like, great, great. Just like Dave said, we get it. We're not really doing self care. We live in a stressful life and everything's not going well. And our bubble bath isn't fixing it. So I'm going to tell our audience a good thing to work on that is the start and the end of self care is know your values. What do you value? And we have an entire podcast on values, on how to find them, what they are, what they mean. But if you are running from your values, self care, self care, self care, self care becomes way more natural.
Your hair has become aware.
It's my self hair.
Yes, your values are so crucial to this step because this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with priority. If am I prioritizing stress, kind of moving away from my values, or am I prioritizing my values and moving towards them? What are my values? Maybe that's a first step. And these things are all nuanced and intermixed, right? This is why we like working with people and the coaching we get to. I won't speak for both of us. For me, what I am enjoying as I am stepping into coaching and guiding is the idea that it's a journey of co-discovery. I get to work with somebody to help them discover what is true for them. And along the way, I get to learn more of what's true for me. And that's because I'm leaning into the discomfort. I choose to go, oh, this is uncomfortable. Let me go jump in. It's kind of like in the movie Divergent. If you've seen it, there's like 5 factions, and one of them's the Dauntless, the Daredevils, the people that are jumping from moving trains onto roofs. And honestly, sometimes self-care feels just like that. Jumping off of a moving 60-mile-per-hour train onto a stationary roof, 300 feet in the air, and you don't know if you're going to make it or not. But here's the, I don't know if I want to share the secret or not. Maybe that's part of the journey.
That'll be $29.95 for that.
Yeah, right. Maybe here's how I know if our audience is listening. Comment and ask, or let us know what you think the secret sauce is of that, because I would really love to know where our audience is at with that. Maybe that turns into its own podcast. Where that gets for me is that going back to the idea of values, am I prioritizing my values? Am I prioritizing my strengths and what is true for me? And that gets really hard to uncover sometimes, but the discomfort is a cue or a clue into where you might be ignoring your values. Because when you choose what's true for you and you choose your values that are aligned with who you are, it's kind of the analogy I used the other night was like coasting down a lazy river. There's effort because you got to get into the river and you got to get into your little tube and, bumble around till you're kind of coasting. But once you're in the tube and gliding, once you're in your values carry you in life. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. So the discomfort is the clue that you're stepping out of your value and into the river and going against the current.
Well, I would say the fact that you're stressed or you have anxiety or depression or your life just isn't working for you, that's the clue that you're not following your values. The discomfort is actually moving from that normal into your values.
You're going to get my one. I love that. You get one. That's great. Yes. Thank you. I think that's a much better nuance of that.
Because we want people out of stress. And so the stress has become a comfort. And it's probably a belief society gave us. You need to be working hard. You need to be pushing. You need to be striving. If you're not stressed out, you're not actually doing the work and you're lazy. And that's another thing that you want to look into when you start real self-care. What is the belief about what's required of you for your worth? What makes you worthy to be in this world? And often that thing is driving you to your stress, driving you to that uncomfortable place where you don't acknowledge yourself, where you don't believe in self-care. On the other side of that belief that makes your worth something external, on the other side of that is where you find your values. Did I lose even you, Dave?
No, I'm just, that was really good. And now I'm sitting here going, that was really good. I think the only thing I want to add to that is that something else that came up from the definition of self-care and what you're sharing is the idea of boundaries. I just want to slightly touch on that because to me, that is a podcast in and of itself again, too. There's a lot we could address there. The idea, though, that I want to hit on here is that one of the things touched on in self-care talk books, those things is the power of saying no and setting boundaries. And one of the things that I would encourage our audience to play with in this is to get clear on your motivations and your values first, so that when you set boundaries, they come from that space. Because when you set boundaries based on a limiting belief or something that isn't true for you, it's not gonna go well. And I don't have a great analogy for that, but I know that that's true because it's I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that? Because
Yeah, it's like another external. The
yeah,
world is telling you you need to set boundaries. So you're trying to set boundaries, but they're not making sense and people are giving pushback. And so you give in because it wasn't legit in the first place.
thank you. Yeah, that's the last little bit I was trying to get out. When you say no in a boundary that is true for you, you are resolved in it. There is a sense of it's like Brene Brown says, you get that hard back, soft front. That's when you're in your value. When someone pushes back on a boundary and you're like, okay, maybe I'll let this one go. Either it's a practice and you need to get back into your value and own that, or get curious about it and go, why did I decide to let go of that boundary, or why did I move the goalpost? Because I think that that leads into some of the self care values as well.
Yeah. And I think a good way to find it, and you kind of spoke to it, Dave, is if you're creating a boundary just because to create a boundary, you're either going to back off or you're going to get angry when people fight it and you're going to fight hard for it because you're trying to just set a boundary. And so, why are people pushing back? And there's an anger to it and I need to create this shell. Or there's a, yeah, no, never mind. I'll do that thing. I'm sorry. Guilt thing. When you're coming from your value, it's like, no, this is me. This is important. And I see that it's bothering you and you're kind. You know, you're not raging against them or giving in. It's just like, this is what it is. And I'm sorry this is uncomfortable for you, but this is the thing. This is
Yeah.
what it is.
Beautiful. So here's my challenge for the audience this week, and something we'd love for you to share with us. Find one, just one way that you do self care right now, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, recreational, socially, just one area where you feel like you practice self care right now, and lean into questioning your self care. Is it a way for you to escape from reality and get some distance? Or is it as I was talking about with the hermit, a retreat into reality where you are feeling more exuberance and joy in life and it's generative and empowering?
Where you feel like you're growing. Is
Yeah.
it just pleasure or is it growth?
And if you get past kind of that first little hurdle and questioning, then go a little step further. What of my where I feel my values are, having listened to our value podcast, am I living my values by doing this type of self-care? Or am I feeling discomfort because this is a value I am learning to look at and move into? So, as always, make sure to give us a like wherever you're listening to. Share us out to your friends and family. We'd love to hear from more people, and always give us a comment. And until next time.
See ya.